industrial killing machine of Auschwitz and other Nazi extermination camps in World War II could not have functioned effectively without the Sonderkommando. These so-called special units were made up of young, strong men who were selected from the incoming transports and forced to work with the SS to ensure the victims chosen for execution in the gas chambers went unknowingly and quietly to their deaths. If they refused to take part in this gruesome process, they were immediately taken away and shot by the SS guards. After the deadly Zyklon B crystals had done their work, it was the Sonderkommando who hauled out the bodies, extracted any gold teeth they could find, and disposed of the corpses in the vast burning pits or in the crematoria. They were to become an integral part of the final solution, a vital part of the extermination process. And they were all Jewish. One of the last surviving members of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando, Henrik Mandelbaum, gave an exceptional interview on film just before he died. Due to the extraordinary efforts of the Czech author and journalist Stanislav Motyl, who spent years courting this last remaining witness to the Holocaust, we can now reveal the true extent of the Sonderkommando's role in the extermination process and the unprecedented moral dilemma they were faced with. Many were executed by the Nazis as inconvenient witnesses, and those who survived the death camps were hunted down by the Russians, who thought they were Nazi collaborators. Others were murdered by Zionist terror groups who roamed Europe in the 50s seeking revenge against anyone even remotely seen as being culpable in the genocide. For those reasons, ex-Sonderkommandos have rarely given interviews or even admitted their true roles in the camps. Mandelbaum's testimony therefore becomes an important historical document, a conclusive first-hand account of the dreadful events which unfolded 65 years ago in the most infamous concentration camp of World War II. The Nazis had chosen Auschwitz as the primary headquarters for the genocide of European Jews. The so-called final solution to the Jewish question meant the death sentence was imposed on 11 million people. Everything was carefully planned on a frosty winter's day in January 1942 on the shores of a suburban Berlin lake. 15 representatives of Nazi Germany gathered there, including one of the main Holocaust architects, Adolf Eichmann. In 1940, the Nazis initially used Auschwitz as a concentration camp for German criminals and Polish political opponents. Because of its central location and excellent rail connections, it quickly developed into the main extermination camp for the final solution, with the building of a huge new camp next door called Birkenau, also known as Auschwitz II. Built in 1941, the whole building process was carefully watched over by Heinrich Himmler, who personally selected the SS guards who ran the camp. Henrik Mandelbaum arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau on April the 22nd, 1944, and was assigned the number 181970. Most of his family, Polish Jews, had already previously been sent to Auschwitz to supposedly work, but soon after arrival, most of them were murdered.
W tej chwili znajdujemy się na największym cmentarzu świata. To jest krematorium numer 2. Krematorium numer 3 i jest tam jakieś 100 metrów stąd, nie? To były bliźniaki. Te krematoria to już były nowoczesna generacja tych krematoriów. I te krematoria wyglądały jak małe zameczki. Nikt by nie powiedział, że tu się gazuje, morduje ludzi. Młodych, starszych, inwalidów. Jednym słowem, wszystkich żyjących ludzi.
At that point, there were already 5 crematoria, each containing gas chambers. Attending the first gassing was Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Höss. In his confession written after having been arrested in 1946, Höss says,
"When the powder was thrown in, there were cries of gas, and then a great bellowing, and the trapped prisoners hurled themselves against the doors. But the doors held and were opened several hours later, so the place might be aired. It was then that I saw, for the first time, gassed bodies en masse. It made me feel uncomfortable and I shuddered, although I had imagined death by gassing would be worse than it was. However, I must admit that it set my mind at rest, for the mass extermination of the Jews was to start soon, and at that time neither Eichmann nor I were certain how these mass killings were to be carried out."
Soon after their invasion of Poland in 1939, the Nazis began to ghettoize the Jewish population. In hundreds of towns across Poland, which was home to Europe's largest concentration of Jews, small areas were walled off, sealing the victims within to await the arrival of the transports for resettlement in the east. They might have to wait years to be resettled, but the process was inevitable. They were loaded into cattle trucks, crammed in like sardines, so they could barely sit down. When the train eventually stopped and the doors suddenly swung open, shouting SS officers with barking dogs pulled the dazed occupants onto the platforms. The guards beat the terrified people into 2 groups, women, children and the elderly to one side, fit young men to the other. From this group of men, a further number were selected, hard, tough young men capable of special duties. These select few were condemned to death, which would be postponed as long as they remained useful. They had the chance of a few extra weeks of life, but at what price? These were the Sonderkommando.
Bo jak jechali do Imnatu w krytych wagonach, a jechali 4 dni, czy nawet 5 dni, upał, bez wody, to co z sobą zabrali, to jeszcze niektórzy tam miał te konserwę, czy serdenkę, nie? To oni przecież, jak już wysiadali, to już byli nie ludźmi. Bo nie wiedzieli, oni byli w dobrych, oni już byli, jak my rozmawiamy, oni byli zmęczeni tą jazdą.
The whole process started with the arrival of the transports, perhaps 2,000 people at a time. All through the day and night, it never stopped. The numbers were truly staggering. For several years, perhaps 9,000 people a day were gassed in Auschwitz, and it was only one of 39 death camps set up by the Nazis.
A tam była, tam het. Wysiadali prawdopodobnie, no tam była mała rampa. Ja wam mogę tylko tyle powiedzieć. My jako pracownicy, przecież my nie czekali, aż oni przyjdą, czy przyjadą. To było ich zadanie, nie? Oni przyszli na miejsce, nie? Nie? Oni przyszli na miejsce. No to się rozbierali do tego.
Perhaps 75% of the new arrivals went, unknowingly, straight to the gas chambers. The remainder went into the camp itself as slaves to work at the nearby Farben synthetic oil and rubber factory, or a select few as Sonderkommando at Auschwitz or at neighbouring Birkenau 3 kilometres down the road. The Sonderkommando would mingle among the newly arrived to reassure them during the selection process. Each group was followed by an ambulance, bearing a Red Cross sign. It would always ride at the tail of this column of people, behind the last batch of victims. This was another deception. The van carried no medication, but cans of the deadly cyanide gas known as Zyklon B. The Sonderkommando would accompany them to the chalet, in which they were to be cleaned up, before going to the accommodation block in the main camp. But many people have wondered why the Sonderkommando didn't warn the new arrivals about what was about to happen to them.
No ja panu powiem, że pan idzie nie do komory gazowej, idzie do łaźni, a do komory gazowej. No i pytam się, no i co panu to da? Pana nie będzie i mnie też nie będzie, bo nie ma możliwości stąd, żeby człowiek się wydostał. Trzeba to zrozumieć. Ja bym niechętnie powiedział. Przecież chętnie bym powiedział, nie? Ja bym chętnie im serce dał też, nie? No ale to nie było żadnej możliwości, i raczej to nic nie dawało. Żeby to coś dało, to na pewno by my im pomogli.
Cruelly, the victims were encouraged to make lists of their possessions and remember the number of their hangers. And what has been described as possibly the cruelest act of all, the Sonderkommando had to give them soap, towels and toothbrushes. Then the Nazis told them there would be a meal waiting for them after the shower. The SS had to maintain this deception. Signs saying, "Move quickly while the water is still warm." There was even an orchestra playing on occasions.